Today's panel, as Lisa started alluding to, is about what's going on in Mexico with AMLO, the electoral reforms, but particularly the media narratives that are occurring regarding that are depicting a democratically elected leader of Mexico as a growing despot or autocrat in waiting, which the two speakers we have today will kind of talk to why is it that that's happening, what is the reality of what's going on in Mexico, and also where does AMLO fit in terms of the history of Mexico. Our first speaker, José Luis Granados Ceja, is a journalist and political analyst based in Mexico City. He's a staff writer with Venezuela Analysis, covering regional and international issues, and writes a monthly opinion column for the Mexico Solidarity Project. And the second speaker is Meizhu Lui, is a co-coordinator of the Mexico Solidarity Project. Her experiences as the daughter of Chinese immigrants and as a single mom led her to focus on addressing inequalities based on race, gender, and immigration status. A hospital kitchen worker, she was elected president of her AFSCME local. She coordinated the National Closing the Racial Wealth Gap Initiative and co-authored The Color of Wealth, the story behind the U.S. racial wealth divide. Liberation Road, a socialist organization, has been her political home. Thank you both for joining us.
It's great to be here.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So our first speaker, Jose, will go first. They're going to give a presentation. So I'm going to spotlight you. So be sure to share your screen with the presentation, Jose.
Hang on a second, it's giving me trouble.
No worries.
There we go. Okay, let's see if I can do it now. There we go.
Wonderful.
Okay, great. So I actually want to start by saying thanks to the organizers of this. Actually, my relationship with the DSA International Committee has always been really, really positive. I think it's doing incredible work. I put a lot of emphasis on the need for people to practice internationalism, and I think the work that the DSA International Committee has done has been tremendous. As Lisa mentioned, we actually met in Venezuela, and it was great to be able to connect with people there and really kind of put into practice that internationalism. I think it's critical. We use this term a lot inside the belly of the beast, but I think in particular, as the processes of transformation throughout Latin America advance, we actually need more and more support from inside the belly of the beast, because those kinds of contradictions really start to sharpen and become probably, arguably, the biggest challenge for people who are here in the global south trying to make that transformation, to be able to know that we count on allies and comrades inside of the United States, Canada, Western Europe, who are able to weaken imperialism so that we're able to advance further. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about, some of you might have read the article that I wrote for The Nation, and that's thanks to the links that Mexico Solidarity Project has been able to do. And I think it was really important to kind of answer that narrative a little bit. As Lisa mentioned in the introduction, the coverage has been really bad and it's getting worse. And it's obviously there's a ramping up for very deliberate reasons we can get into a little bit. But I wanted to give the context, like why is this happening? So I just titled the presentation AMLO, which is what supporters of the president call him, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the election reform and the defense of national sovereignty. So how do I, there we go. So as you can see here, the protests against Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's reforms to the National Electoral Institute, or INE by its Spanish acronym, must be understood in the context of the opposition's declining sway. I think that's the key takeaway that we need to have from this experience. What is happening right now is related to politics, of course, but it's about the way that basically the way that the scenario changed since the 2018 election. So in 2018, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, running on behalf of Morena, which is an upstart party, it's less than, was founded in 2014, won by over 30 million votes. And he beat his nearest rival by 30 points. So it kind of gives you an idea of just how overwhelming that victory was. It was clearly a moment in the country where there was a mood for change, to oust the previous regime, which I've taken to call and kind of invoking the French Revolution, the ancien regime, right? The old regime. And I say that because it's not just one political party, but what we call here in Mexico, the PRIAN, the PRI and the PAN, which ruled collectively, alternating in power for basically 100 years in Mexico. Obviously, those parties had different kind of characterizations at the time, but certainly the neoliberal period, which is basically from the late 80s onwards up until 2008, it was very much dominated by this ideology, the neoliberal ideology that these parties defended. So since then, Morena has won 12 out of 15 governorships in Mexico. It gives you an idea of just how they're actually expanding their territorial reach and their political power. And they now control 20 out of 32 federal entities, so basically states and Mexico City. So an overwhelming majority, and they're actually likely to win in the next race that's coming up this year in the state of Mexico, where the PRI has ruled for nearly 100 years. So Mexico's opposition, which is made out of the PRI, the PAN, the PRD, and Movimiento Ciudadano. So the PRI is kind of like a center-right party. The PAN is a further right party. The PRD was founded as a leftist party, but moved to the right, particularly during Peña Nieto's term, the previous administration. And Movimiento Ciudadano, we call them the El Pan Naranja, which is that, so they kind of try to portray themselves as social democrats, but they're actually a right-wing party. Anytime they're in power, they end up employing neoliberal orthodoxy and abandoning the social causes that they claim to defend. And the problem is that they haven't been able to articulate a response to this new political reality. I say this a lot. They kind of view it as an aberration, that this is an exception to the rule. Soon enough, they'll be back in power and things will go back to normal. And so I share this slide here because they view the Mexican people with contempt, with disdain. This is a picture of Lorenzo Córdoba. He is the head of the National Electoral Institute. And this is him basically mocking a duly elected representative who was criticizing his administration as the head of the National Electoral Institute. And it gives you an idea of just kind of that contemptuous attitude that so many of the people who were close to the previous regime, have towards this. They think that they're not worthy of kind of even like the most minimal respect. And so that's why you see these kinds of this flaunting of people's position, right? Like in this particular incident happened in front of in a recent meeting of the Electoral Institute, where the representative from the legislative branch was making an intervention, and he basically spent the whole time laughing and mocking her, despite the fact that he is not an elected person and she was there representing the legislative branch, right? And so I'd say that to kind of put things in context, because right now what's happening is in the context of what in Mexico we call the fourth transformation. This is a picture I took yesterday from the Zócalo, which is, if you've been in Mexico City, it's that big, huge public square, the center of power. You have the Catholic Church on one side and the National Palace on the other, the offices of the city government in a different corner. And so it's the site of political demonstrations. And here you can see they filled the Zócalo. There's this blow up doll of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. But I want to draw your attention to the banner that's at the top. It's hanging there. It says "En defensa de la soberanía nacional," in defense of national sovereignty. And there's this deliberate effort to try to link what's happening today with sort of the historical political struggles in Mexico. So you'll see 1938 next to the picture of Mexican President Lázaro Cárdenas, who was the president who most tried to actually meet the obligations to the Mexican people that came out of the Mexican Revolution. So we're talking land reform, nationalization of industry, and industrial development, support for trade unions, et cetera, right? Probably in the 20th century, the best president that Mexico had. In the 1960s, there's a picture of López Mateos. So he nationalized the electricity industry. So again, with the same vision that there are certain pillars of development that need to be under state control. And then in the middle, we see López Obrador, 2022, when he nationalized lithium production in the country. And so you see, I did an interview with a number of people, and very much Morena sees themselves as the heirs of these political struggles, as saying that we're trying to continue this transformation in the country, and that's why it's called the fourth transformation. The first being the struggle for independence, the second being the reform period under Benito Juárez, the kind of the liberal conservative struggle that happened, the third being the Mexican Revolution, and this now being the fourth one. And I want to share this anecdote with you, and I want you to remember a little bit of that kind of what I talked to you about, that contemptuous attitude that some of the country's elites have towards the population. So they'll say that everybody who was there was only there because they gave them a free sandwich and they were bussed in and they don't know why they're there, et cetera, et cetera. So I ended up, I was getting hungry and there was tacos de canasta, and I, just lined up and ended up chatting with somebody in line, and we were talking. He was like, "Oh, I'm so glad to be here," and I could tell he had a little bit of an accent from a different region of Mexico. And his name was Ricardo Valdez Ponce from Matamoros, Tamaulipas. And he was telling me the whole adventure that he had to go through to be here, to make it here, to show that his support for the president, right? Traveled 15 hours by bus. And he gave me this quote that I thought really resonated with me. He said, "I do it with pleasure because we've never had a president like the one we have now. I am very proud and motivated to be here accompanying our president." And as he was saying that, you could see the tears forming in his eyes. And that's the level of political commitment to this, of a sense that feeling that in power, for once, there's somebody who truly represents their interests. And I think that stands in great contrast to the narrative that's out there, right? That he's unpopular, that he's an authoritarian, he's trying to, secure his place in power, et cetera, et cetera. So I mentioned this a little bit just previously. And so I want to show you kind of like, again, that contemptuous attitude. This is a tweet from, actually, she's a public official here in Mexico City, working for one of the delegation governments. So like New York City, Mexico City's so big that it has boroughs. So she works for one of the boroughs, which is controlled by the opposition, as the anti-discrimination czar, but, shows pictures of like, that the supporters of the president are zombies, that they're only there because they're getting, it's just like that kind of that attitude, I think is really important. Why do I stress this so much? Because they're unable to win over the population. So the opposition is trying to seek and assert power and influence via other means. And this was kind of the crux of the article that I was able to write for The Nation, which is that basically what happens is, because they're unable to, they no longer count on the state as like the primary element for them to exert their power. They've lost control of the federal government. And so they run off into their strongholds, I call them. In Spanish, we call them reductos, which I think is a little bit clearer about what I'm trying to communicate there. But they're just trying to figure out ways where they can continue to have power, continue to have influence, despite the fact that they're just not a popular organization anymore. And so that's the key thing to understanding why all of this is happening. So where do they do this? Through the private media, similar to in the United States, through the courts, similar to the United States, and of course, with the topic of the day, right, through the National Electoral Institute. So the National Electoral Institute, despite what they say in the mainstream media as it being this, well-regarded institution, technically it is a very good institution, right? It runs elections well. And that's really important because that's a conquest of grassroots struggles inside of Mexico that were demanding that there be a more accountable system to actually, because we've gone through a number of frauds, the biggest one being 1988, where Salinas de Gortari was able to consummate the fraud and enter power and really drive the neoliberal period in 2006, which was actually the first time that López Obrador ran for the presidency. It's widely disputed. There was mass protests for weeks afterwards, but basically the elites colluded in order to consummate that fraud. So there's a long history there of a lot of distrust for the National Electoral Institute. Nonetheless, López Obrador is kind of on this, he's like, I'm not a man who's interested in vengeance and getting that. So, but that changed. So whereas he wasn't interested in any kind of reform, in 2021, the INE decided to cancel the registration of two of Morena's candidates for governorships. They mentioned there, Félix Salgado Macedonio in Guerrero and Raúl Morón Orozco in Michoacán. And so they weren't allowed to represent their party, basically over very minor violations of electoral law. And this was particularly worrisome for the Morena supporters, for the government supporters, because it was seen as disproportional. It was seen as an effort to try to harm Morena politically through undemocratic means. right? Ultimately, then actually both the replacement candidates they selected ended up winning anyway, and so it didn't really work out in their favor. But it was really stood in contrast as well to the behavior of the Electoral Institute in the 2017 election, which was there was widespread illegal actions in the Mexico state elections, and so they, the contrast was really evident, and so there was this decision that was clearly made by the López Obrador government to try to discipline the INE, and it's logical, right? If you have these entrenched elites inside of these strongholds coming after you, trying to harm you politically, then you got to push back, right? And this was the way to do it. So originally the proposal was for a constitutional reform. And so basically to make pretty deep changes that would include like popular election for the councilors and things like that. But obviously a constitutional reform requires a supermajority. Morena has a simple majority, but they don't have a supermajority. In the previous legislature, they were able to pass some constitutional reforms, negotiation with the opposition. But in this one, they weren't able to, right? It's because it became kind of the cause du jour for the opposition. So they moved on to the Plan B. And this is the one that's been in the media. It's the one you've been reading about. And it's kind of funny. We'll get into this a little bit later, but it's not really much of a reform. It's very, very simple. Basically, it's kind of like it reduces their budget. It moves towards the possibility of doing electronic voting. They want to bring in votes from abroad in order to help facilitate the participation of Mexicans who are no longer in the country. There's also measures to try to like support the diversity of representation so that it's not just, the same kind of people running over and over again, et cetera, et cetera. But, and they also critically they remove the ability to kind of cancel candidates, right? Obviously responding to what had happened previously. So the law was passed in quick fashion in both houses of Congress. And I think one of the key things to remember also about this proposal is that, and I mentioned it here, it's a pillar. It's a key element of López Obrador's government, which is what he calls Republican austerity. And I know that's a scary word for people in North America. Austerity is usually something negative. We have to understand that we had a really bloated state. And so the elites of this country, the political and economic elites, would use the state to enrich themselves, to get themselves cozy positions, to hire all their friends. And so the argument that López Obrador made on the campaign trail was you can't have a wealthy government and a poor people. And so he implemented this that he calls the Republican austerity, which basically belt tightening, but with the aim of taking that money that was used to be spent on the bureaucracy and putting it to social programs. So it's not austerity in the sense of cutting services. It's actually quite the opposite. And the INE is probably the clearest example of this excess expenditure and top-heavy bureaucracy. The Constitution actually says explicitly that no public servant can earn more than the president, and the head of the Electoral Institute actually earns twice as much. So it's just flagrantly violating. We call it here la burocracia dorada, the gilded bureaucracy. Where they can hire all their friends to be advisors. They have a huge budget. They have a personal driver, the top of the line healthcare, et cetera, right? It's basically this layer, this 1% on top of society, which is very poor, right? Like the Lorenzo Córdoba, the gentleman I showed at the beginning, he earns somewhere between $13,000 and $14,000 US a month, where the minimum wage in this country is $10 a day. So it gives you an idea of just like the huge disparity and why that was a point. Now, this whole defense of the INE has become a rallying cry of the opposition. Because I said that they don't have a lot of weight, they don't really have any much sway, they've latched onto this. And in some sense, it is working. They've held mass rallies. We should be honest about that. A lot of people have turned out to their rallies to say, we disagree with this, right? And now the opposition feels like they own this issue, right? But the truth is that, people aren't necessarily rallying because they back the opposition. They're rallying because this issue resonates with them. And a lot of it is due to misinformation. I mentioned previously, the role of the private media. They've been saying this, they're going to take away your voter ID card. The voter ID cards basically are national ID. You need it for everything. They want to take that away, or they want to hurt your ability to vote. This is all in anticipation of a fraud, right? And so they held this big rally, and then in response, and I think this is important to really highlight here, it's the battle of the streets. Who can mobilize more? Who owns the streets? And I think, we should take some pride as leftists to say that we own the streets. And so López Obrador called his own demonstration in the country's capital. And it's hard to say because the streets were literally rivers of people, but somewhere around 1 million people turned out under the hot sun to just get a glimpse of the president, to say hello. He walked along Paseo de la Reforma, which is the big major avenue in the center of the capital, greeting everybody who wanted to greet him, hours, and then gave a long speech in the plaza. And so, you know, if it was a battle of the streets, the pro-government won. And I give you here's a couple of pictures from that. You can kind of see, you know, the rivers of people that filled the Reforma Avenue, that filled the Zócalo. You know, we have demonstrations that like a real profound commitment. These are the same people that the opposition says, oh, they're only there because they offered them free food. They're only there because they were forced to go, et cetera, right? Like that's the kind of, but people are like, no, we're here because of our personal convictions, like that anecdote I shared with you. So then the opposition held a second rally to reject the president's plan B. And in this one, they were less careful to kind of be nonpartisan, whereas in the first one, they were like, no, we're just here to defend the INE. This one, openly political speeches, openly aggressive positions against the government, sort of taking that stance, right? Now, as I said, despite holding these two sizable demonstrations, it's really unlikely that the opposition is going to translate any of this into electoral victories. They're unpopular. They don't have, you can't even name a single figure. There's no one that's really kind of shining in terms of being like the person who's going to be the standard bearer for the opposition. They're very fractured. You got to remember, these are also you know, it's not just one political party, even though they're kind of working together now. They obviously have their own interests, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's very unlikely that this is going to really turn into anything. And then that's the risk. This is a picture from yesterday's demonstration that shows that, again, once again, the battle of the streets, the Morena supporters won, the president supporters won, right? There were more people, there was more enthusiasm, there was more energy. Not to discredit, I think it's very valid that the opposition also mobilizes, but I think we can say confidently that, you know, the government supporters won the day. So here, I want to close with this. We know that the labeling of any leftist leader as a threat to the country and democracy is a classic strategy in Latin America. We've seen it consistently. You know, we mentioned I work for Venezuela Analysis. I've been doing a lot of Venezuela solidarity work, and that's been the classic strategy, right? To undermine, to apply sanctions, to really try to punish the Venezuelan people, in that case, for daring to elect a government that doesn't abide by Washington's dictates. Same thing is happening here, but it is a risk, right? Because Mexico's on the border with the United States. It's unlike many other countries in the region, it's still the #1 trading relationship. And so there is a danger there. At the speedy approval of it, it happened relatively quickly. There wasn't a consensus, we could say, means that you can almost predict it today, that it come 2024, which is the next presidential election, they will say that the was not free and fair and that the results are unreliable. They're going to cry fraud. It's the classic strategy. And that is a very real danger. And I think why it's also very important that we're having this seminar. I'm really grateful for everybody who's here because we're going to need to be able to answer that narrative. We need to go against that image that they're going to be trying to portray. And like I said here, the worst case scenario could lead to sanctions, and those are punishing. It's collective punishment. They should be classified as a crime against humanity. It hasn't. That's because international law kind of favors the powerful, but it's still something that is really worrisome. Anyway, and just closing here with an image here of like sort of the adulation that people had. You can see it as they were watching the president give his speech. You know, and we can get into this, and I hope we do. I'm not here to say that everything López Obrador is doing is correct, that Morena is the model to follow, et cetera, et cetera. There are criticisms inside of our political process, and they're valid. But I think it's important that we focus on our role here, for example, with the Mexico Solidarity Project, with DSA, IC, which is just kind of making sure that we have room to breathe, right? That we have the room to operate politically, so that activists and organizers inside of the country, people like myself, who want the process to go further, who want a radicalization, who want to start really affecting the interests of the bourgeoisie, have the space to do it. Because if we're constantly under siege by imperialism, then it's going to limit us, right? We're going to be constantly on the defensive, and it actually limits our ability to criticize, because then it's like, well, all criticism gets lumped together. And the truth is that we need to be able to have that space to be able to say, hey, these are things we're not going further enough. And just to name, just to show that I'm sincere about this, right? I've been very vocal about the migration policy in a lot of ways, that we are very much doing the United States' dirty work and preventing migration of people, of asylum seekers and refugees, and that's a problem, and it needs to change, right? But part of that is also the negotiation that the government is doing with the United States government, because to have that room to breathe, right? Very much so, like a lot of the policies that López Obrador has been able to implement is basically kind of been that trade-off. All right, we'll do the dirty work for you, but don't protest too loudly when we nationalize lithium, for example, right? And so that's why I think it's really important. The other issue, obviously, being the crisis of femicides that is happening in this country. That is a problem. I don't think that the government has handled it particularly well, kind of discrediting the movement. The movement is valid. It's been infiltrated. There are elements there that are clearly opposition, that are trying to, wave that flag in the same way that they're trying to do with the INE. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that that isn't an issue in this country and that we need to work on. And so anyway, with that, I close, and I'm looking forward to all the questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jose. All right, so that was a great presentation. Next speaker will be Meizhu. Could you share your screen with your presentation?
Hi, everybody. Can you see that?
It's loading.
Well, while it's loading, just let me say that I'm really, really happy to be here with the DSA IC, because not only is international solidarity important, as Luisa was saying, but left unity is really important. And for those of us on the left to get together, to be able to play nicely is really what is needed, because we're way too fragmented. So it's really excellent to be here today. And, as Jose has eloquently said, the US press and the Mexican press, which is still dominated by the elites there, is trying to tar and feather President AMLO, tar him by calling him an autocrat, feather him by calling him a buffoon and a clown. So he's like an incompetent person to be running this country. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background, because one of the reasons I'm so happy that DSA is doing this on Mexico is that it's quite surprising how little people in the United States know about Mexico, and how little they understand how important Mexico is to the people of the United States, and not just vice versa. So let's just go back for a minute. In 1848, the United States annexed nearly 40% of Mexico. And so I like to say that Mexico is not just a neighbor, it's like a half sister or half brother, as we overlap. So all that land in the Southwest, here we go. The gray, the red, those all were part of Mexico until the US illegally grabbed that land. That war was so unpopular. It was opposed by Lincoln. It was opposed by Henry David Thoreau, who went to jail rather than pay taxes that would support that war. And perhaps the most extreme example of solidarity was the San Patricios, the Irish soldiers who threw off their uniforms and joined Mexican side. And just a shout out, given that it's the day after St. Patrick's Day, and so talking about solidarity, that was probably the biggest example. But given this closeness, again, it's just really surprising how little attention there is on Mexico in the United States. Annexation of 40% of Mexico was superly significant to the United States. If it were not for that annexation, the US would not be the superpower that it is today. It might have been a second-rate capitalist country like France or Germany, but because of all the resources that it was able to gain, and because of the ports in California that gave it access from the Atlantic to the Pacific. I like to remember the song that we all sang as kids, America the Beautiful, that ends, crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Well, it didn't hit me until much, much later, but that was a song of destiny, justifying the grabbing of a part of Mexico as if God gave us the right to be there from sea to shining sea. So once too, it was annexed, and the United States was such a military power. The United States has always been able to exploit both the land and the people of Mexico. So we know about the mining and so on that went on in Mexico, but in one of our interviews recently with Jason Porter, who looks at agriculture and pesticide, even though after the Mexican Revolution, foreigners were not supposed to own land, they were able to figure out ways around that. And this is one of the industrialists who, agribusinesses who had cotton industry that was enormous and used pesticides there that led to the slow deaths of many Mexican worker. We were also able to exploit Mexican labor, as we know from the guest worker program, the braceros, some 70 some years ago, 90 years ago, but we're still doing the same thing with the temporary work programs right now, the H2A and B. So all of that is just to say, and we do know how much the United States has gained from being able to exploit those resources. It has made America wealthy. It has made it into a superpower. So fast forward to today, Mexico is probably the country that can kind of put the biggest hurt on US imperialism. So it is extremely important for those of us on the left to take a look at this. And why? I'll just give you a quick question. I already mentioned that AMLO has really stressed the right of Mexico to exercise its own sovereignty. It doesn't have to cater to the will of the United States. And by doing the renationalization of the oil industry, AMLO has really kind of thrown down the gauntlet to the US, because oil interests in the United States do not want this at all. Because in the past, under the neoliberal governments, the United States oil got first precedent over Mexican oil in terms of Mexico's buying it and the use of it. So it paid its foreign oil companies before its own. The other way it's exercising sovereignty is around its own food. So under AMLO's government, they have said they're not going to allow the importation of GMO
anymore. And the United States has, of course, loudly protested. In terms of labor, Secretary, the trade representative, Catherine Tai, has been pretty good, but we do have NAFTA, and she has been pushing for Mexico to repeal this and to allow the importation of US GMO corn. So sovereignty is something that the United States does not want. It does not want to be able to no longer exploit Mexican resource. Another thing is that AMLO and Mexico have led the way to oppose US domination of the Americas. So you might remember last summer, well, you might not remember because it really didn't get much of play because it was a failure. President Biden organized a summit of the Americas, but he chose who could be considered a participant in the Americas and excluded Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. AMLO protested and boycotted because of that exclusion. And it wasn't necessarily that he supported all of those countries. It was that he didn't think it was right for the United States to call the shots and to say who could come and who could not come. And because of his action, the rest of Latin America also responded. Several other countries also boycotted, and some on the stage with President Biden
openly criticized the United States for its undemocratic behavior in terms of the rest of the Americas. And AMLO has also called for the dissolution of the OAS, the Organization of American States, and says that what they need is a different organization that excludes the United States so that they can get their own act together. So these things, of course, are all challenging US imperialism to their chagrin. The last thing is that AMLO really, and his government really puts the United States to shame when it comes to social programs. So, as Jose said, he said, the country can't be wealthy and the people poor. So we have had a fantastic fight for 15 over the last number of years, and we have made a lot of gains in the US because of that. Well, in the United States, they have a person in charge of in charge of the minimum wage, and it has been raised every single year. And will continue to be so. So again, that's the type of social programs that is making AMLO so popular with the people. They know that he is, for the first time, not just trying to cater to the elite, not to the 1%, but is really trying to do what he can to lift up the living standard and the lives of the people at the base. Well, none of this goes down too well with the US because, again, it makes them look bad. And I can't understand why he would still be so popular, although the reasons are fairly obvious. He still has an over 60% popularity rating almost at the end of his presidency, which is unheard of as in the United States. You know that in the midterms, usually the other party gains power and seats. In Mexico, not so, just the opposite. The Morena party has continued to grow. So I guess what we're seeing is the United States media following the right-wing media of Mexico, just kind of parroting their line. And they'll grab onto any issue that will make AMLO and Morena look bad. So it is up to us, and this is why really happy for this webinar and for DSA-IC to raise this issue. It's up to us now to really set the record straight and try to get as many people as possible in the United States to not listen to the fake news and to learn what the truth really is. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Meizhu. Yeah, the presentations were done really well. Yeah, so we're going to move into questions. People have already started submitting questions here in the call, but we also have some questions that we prepared ahead of time. So maybe I'll combine some of them since there's some similar themes. There's one here, for instance, that we have here. Either Jose or Meizhu can answer this. What are the similarities with the media narrative with AMLO as the leaders of other Latin American countries? And I think something similar with regarding to domestic one. There's a question here by Jeffrey. It says, isn't Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador called by some as Mexico's Bernie Sanders as him being current president of Mexico? How would you say is like the parallels like in terms of the media narratives that exist, calling AMLO, all these things, but in terms of other Latin American countries, but also domestically with like people said about Bernie Sanders running for president?
Jose, why don't you start in terms of Latin America?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, if we remember that we talked before about like the pink wave that started with the election of Hugo Chavez in 1998, and then Evo Morales, Rafael Correa. So like this wave of progressive and leftist presidents that were elected. And a lot of that was kind of stopped in its track with what we called the conservative restoration, la restauración conservadora, where similarly many of the gains that were achieved in this period were unfortunately lost with the arrival of right of center pro-Washington governments. Well, in some ways, López Obrador kind of marked the beginning of that second pink wave. He was elected 2018 and then was followed by a succession of progressive governments being elected. The key thing I think to take away, I think sometimes we can get a little bit too wrapped up in like this or that label. As much as I personally identify as a socialist and I want to see, that I put first and foremost the class struggle, like what are the conditions on the ground? For example, what does López Obrador kind of baptize his political thinking? He calls it humanismo mexicano, Mexican humanism. right? But what is it? It's basically a social democratic party position, which is to say, we want to take the wealth of the natural resources wealth, the rents from this, and redistribute it through direct cash programs. Yesterday, the president mentioned that 75% of households in Mexico benefit one way or another from the government programs. So there's stuff like Sembrando Vida, which supports people to plant trees. There's Jóvenes Construyendo Futuro, which gives young people a head start in terms of accessing formal employment. There's scholarships for students. I'm a master's student here at the Autonomous University of Mexico City. And thanks to the changes that were made at the federal level from the supervising body called CONACYT, which manages the scholarships, it was opened up. And my program, which is the Defense and Promotion of Human Rights, which is not the kind of program that, would be beneficial to those who pursue the neoliberal logic, didn't get funded, but now it does, right? And so now I'm able to benefit personally from that. And it makes a difference, right? Like I'm a working class person. I wouldn't be, I go to I get a quality education from a university that doesn't charge tuition fees, and I'm paid a monthly stipend to be able to study that, right? Like that makes a difference for the lives of people. And you could say that about pretty much every single social program. It's basically the construction of a welfare state, right? The idea that and so that very much is the same logic of a lot of the different processes that are happening. When people talk about like the Bernie Sanders, right? Like, yeah, in a lot of ways you could use that comparison is apt, because what did Bernie Sanders represent? Sort of a break with the traditional political elites in the United States, somebody who had a long history of kind of being on the right side of history, of always kind of advocating for the interests of the working class and the poor. In a lot of ways, that's López Obrador as well, right? And in fact, that's why he's so demonized, right? Because that anecdote I shared, there's a very sincere connection with the country's working class and poor majority, right? Like that people feel represented by him, because there is we say this a lot here in Mexico, el pueblo es bueno, el pueblo es sabio, right? Like the people are smart, they're wise, they're good, they understand what is that qualitative difference in their political leadership, right? It's a government that doesn't repress the way that the other ones used to, right? Like you weren't able to have these kinds of demonstrations before without feeling the wrath of the security forces of the state, right? That there's a qualitative difference that people can certainly perceive that. And so, yeah, I saw someone mention Lula da Silva as well. It's kind of that same logic, and like I said previously, right, that's good. We should support that. But I'm hoping that we actually continue to radicalize, to continue to actually talk about what does a post-capitalist economy look like, and how do we actually get there?
Yeah, no, that was great, Jose. I just wanted to say that one of the differences is that if Bernie had won, which we all would have liked, he would have had a much more difficult time than AMLO, because AMLO's victory came from his base of social movements and various alliances he's made. So it was just an overwhelming victory. I mean, if Bernie won, it would not have, his base would not be as big as what AMLO had. So the changes that we would have been able to see would have been good, but I don't think as big or significant as what AMLO has been able to do.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to try to get through the questions people have. I'm going to prioritize questions I think are relevant based on what we've been talking about, and try to combine some of them. There's this question here with what's the issue with the fact that there's a journalist that died in Mexico? Are they kind of telling the truth about what's going on, or regarding organized crime? Who are the people who see the press as the enemy within Mexico, and what accurate reporting from Mexico can be relied on for information that is somewhat accurate? And to kind of combine with other question that we have prepared here, which is basically like how can we make sure that those of us in the US can get real information about what's happening in Mexico? Yeah, so either of you.
Go ahead.
Sure,
and start
I'll handle the one around journalists. I work as a journalist. I'm active in organizations that are working on this issue. It's a real issue, right? Like it's a challenge, but all this goes back actually to what I mentioned previously in the presentation, which is the 2006 fraud. So the 2006 election, I would argue, was won by López Obrador, right? But it was stolen, they were allowed, and the other candidate, Felipe Calderón, was able, thanks to political negotiations, maneuvering, to secure the presidency. But he came in incredibly weak. He came in with basically no legitimacy, right? We had mass movements in the streets demanding that that the election be held anew or to be canceled, et cetera, et cetera. So incredibly weak politically. So what does he do? He starts a war. What unites a country better than war? Literally a few weeks after taking office, in a comical way, he goes to Michoacán. He puts on this oversized military coat, which doesn't fit him well, and he's trying to kind of portray this image of authority and power, and he declares war on the cartels. So we recently saw the conviction of Genaro Garcia Luna, who was Felipe Calderón's right-hand man on security policy. Like the United States, we have secretaries here, so he was the Secretary of Public Security, of Public Safety. He was the mastermind of the strategy, and it turns out he was in league with the cartels. Right? We knew this all along. Even back then, we were warning about this. They're like, this isn't, we used to say this isn't a war against the cartels. It's a war between the cartels, and with obviously the Mexican government taking a side. And so that unleashed the violence that we're still dealing with today, right? Because the strategy was the kingpin strategy. And so they would go after the heads of organized crime groups, and all that would do was splinter them, which would increase the violence, which would increase their power, right? And so the situation of human rights defenders, the situation of journalists is very much tied to this, right? Like the lack of security that exists in Mexico is a result of this terrible strategy. The strategy of trying to go after organized crime and favoring one over the other. And so, yes, there are parts of the country where they have incredible strength, these organized crime groups. And those are the ones that you're generally seeing are the ones targeting journalists and human rights offenders. So a human rights offender, say somebody who's a water defender, right? And is trying to protect access to their community's resources. Well, they become the target of these organized crime groups because it affects their interests, right? If a journalist publishes a story that doesn't make somebody look good, they go after them. If there's somebody who's in cahoots with organized crime and somebody exposes that, they receive threats up to and actually, as we've seen, numerous killings. And that's a very real issue. There's not the government hasn't done enough. There is more they could do. They could better fund the protection mechanism. They could do more efforts to ensure that there is an impunity in these cases, that there's actual prosecution when these incidents do happen. But I do want to close with this, which is that a lot of times what you see in the media is that it's the fault of López Obrador for criticizing the press. And there's a lot of very deliberate distortion of his message, because he has a weekly or daily press conference every day, around 2-3 hours a day in the mornings, and where he dialogues directly with journalists. And he says to them explicitly, he's like, it's not you, it's not the people who are sitting in the room, it's the owners of your outlet that I have a problem with, right? Like that they're the ones who are distorting things, because like in the United States, right? Like the corporate media has economic and political interests. And so they make those manifest through their coverage, or the way that they try to cover, the national government. And so because he criticizes media outlets and their owners, they try to distort that, say that, well, his attacks on the press is what's making it so that there's so much impunity. And that's just not the case. That's not what's actually happening here. It's a very kind of dangerous logic to say that, oh, it's his fault. Could the government be doing more? Yes. And I hope that we do. Like, I'm involved in advocacy groups calling for that. But this idea that it's López Obrador's fault is a wild distortion, because the truth is that we inherited this situation in the country. And then the final thing I would say is that there's a change in kind of the logic, right? They don't use that bellicose language anymore, the war against the cartels and going after organized crime. Instead of talking about that, they say, venimos a conquistar la paz. We came to achieve peace, which is a very different kind of thinking, right? And attacking the root causes, right? Like these social programs are designed so that people don't turn to organized crime, so that there's an alternative, so that the young person who finishes their high school and doesn't know what to do with their lives has an option to pursue formal employment somewhere, as opposed to joining the ranks of these organized crime groups, which, again, we got to remember, where do they get their arms and money? Well, from the United States, right? That if they didn't have customers in the United States, they wouldn't have the power that they do. And so that's also a challenge to US policymakers. Like, why is it that Mexico has to put the lives on the line? Why are we the ones who have to spill the blood, right? With this whole fentanyl issue, for example, they want us to, now they want us to go after the cartels again, as if that worked in the previous strategy, because it's easy, right? Why aren't they going after distribution networks inside the United States, right? Like, how do you think these drugs are getting into people's possession inside of the United States and Canada and Western Europe, right? There are other criminal networks. Why do we have to pursue the militarized strategy? It doesn't work. And like, I think history has proven that.
So I would just add that, there's the federal government, but there are the state and local governments as well. So the federal government is dominated by Morena, but there are still PAN and PRI governors in a number of states. And at the local level too, you still have the old guard in charge, who are still in cahoots with some of the cartels. So it's impossible to make it safe for journalists and others right away. I think it's going to take more time, as we know from trying to fight the drug wars in the United States as well. And I think both countries realized that the military solution was wrong. But I was going to say, in terms of the media, to get back to that, we just had the conviction of Luna, as Jose pointed out, but has there been a lot in the US press about, oh, he was connected to a PRI president, and gee, the PRI was so corrupt, they were in bed with the cartels, they were in bed with gun companies, they're responsible for the murders of so many people, the deaths in both countries. Yet, what do we hear in defense of still to get paid their high salaries and have staff and luxury lives? That's the news that we're hearing about, which is pretty crazy, which is the real news. So what can we do about it? The Mexico Solidarity Project organized a call a few weeks ago, just recently, that Luisa has been part of as well, to form an organized response to this negative media. We need to get ourselves together. We have a number of wonderful independent journalists like Jose. So pulling them together and saying, let's see as soon as the news comes out that we know is fake news, that is not putting the facts forward, let's be able to do a rapid response. And that is just being organized, but we hope to be able to do that because we know that the attacks are escalating and will continue to escalate up to the 2024 elections. We know that the United States, both parties, love to use Mexico as a whipping boy as they campaign, which one is doing more to stop immigrants from coming across the border, which is doing more to punish Mexico for its cartel activity. So it's really important up right now and for the next year that we really ramp up our effort to get real news out there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just do one more question because of time, but going to combine two questions that have been asked, one by Stephen. Apart from AMLO as an individual, what is Morena's composition as a political party? How do they organize, conduct political education, maintain such a large and engaged mass movement? And are there obvious contenders to succeed AMLO after the end of this term next year? And combining that with a question by Andrew, what do we see the future of Morena beyond AMLO and how we, DSA in the US, might lend a hand?
It's great.
Sure, I'll go first, and maybe Meizhu can jump in afterwards if that's working well. So Morena was founded as a movement first. It was not founded as a political party. It's actually called, it's an acronym, Movimiento de Renovación Nacional, National Regeneration Movement. But they held an assembly where they decided, no, we're going to become a political party. We're going to contest power. We want to be able to win the presidency, and sure enough, they did in the next election after their founding in 2018, which I mentioned previously. So Morena is, I'll give you a really honest answer. It's fallen victim to what happens to so many political movements, right? It's founded as a movement. It's designed to be that way. There was always an emphasis on kind of maintaining that grassroots base. And while it is still very much engaged, it's very much become an electoral machine. Right, that's what unfortunately happens in many of these circumstances, where for the sake of expediency, they end up kind of concentrating power in the executive of the party, and they make all the decisions. And there is some discontent among some sectors of the party in terms of how things have been handled, because a lot of the cadre are now working for the government, right? So you lose a lot of that element, that capacity to organize and mobilize. And they actually had a lot of foresight. They were like, we have to really focus on political education. And there was a decision made in one of its congresses to dedicate half of the public resources that they get from the state, every party is publicly funded, to its political education institute. But a lot of things happen in sort of internal dynamics, which I can't really get into too much, but basically it wasn't able to take off until very recently, right? And then we had the pandemic. And so a lot of the work for developing new cadre to kind of fill in all of those spaces hasn't happened. And so it's a little bit behind, which brings me to the second half of the question, which is like, what's next? Everything right now inside of the party is basically organized like who's going to be the successor. So AMLO is limited by the Constitution from running again. He said to himself, even if he could, he doesn't want to, right? Like, he's older and he's been at this for a very, very long time, and he just wants to retire. And so there's three leading candidates. Adán Augusto López, that's his Interior Secretary. Marcelo Ebrard, who's the Foreign Secretary, and Claudia Sheinbaum, who is the Mexico City governor. It's called Jefa de Gobierno, but because it's, Mexico City's 9 million people, it's like a state governorship. López Obrador says any one of those three would be great. I know that if they are the candidate, that they will do a good job of continuing the process. But that's his line. The truth is, inside of the left here in Mexico, there's one candidate that really would represent a deepening of the transformation. That wouldn't just kind of be a continuation or even a kind of a regression. And that's Claudia Sheinbaum. That's this Mexico City mayor. And so that's really key to pay attention to in terms of to making the thing that the left inside of Mexico is working on, at least the electoral left, because there is a non-electoral left, which we didn't really get into today, but is pushing to that she's the candidate, right? I think Marcelo Ebrard is very cozy with the United States. You would likely see a weakening of kind of the more anti-imperialist, pro-sovereignty positions that we've seen from López Obrador. Adán Augusto is very much would kind of just be continuation, more of the same, but she would represent a left position. And there's a lot of discussion happening right now around what to do, what's next in terms of how to support, and a lot of that will involve reaching out to Mexicans in the United States, right? There's this idea that they're going to have a voice in this process to be able to select the next candidate, and so there's a renewed impetus to be able to facilitate communications, get more information about what's happening, and also, doing it bilingually. That's one of the key things that Mexico Solidarity Project has been really focused on, right? There has to be this effort to reach out to people. We know, I grew up in the United States. We know I grew up in a certain context so that I was able to keep my Spanish, but we know that that's not the case for many communities, right? And we know that a lot of parents, they're like, oh, well, I don't want my child to suffer discrimination, so I'm not going to teach them Spanish, and so they grew up speaking English, and that's fine. There are reasons for that. I'm not judging that whatsoever, but that means that we have to be able to communicate in English, and that's one of the key things that we're working on to try to increase that level of work, and also kind of convince people inside of Morena that that's important, that that's the kind of work that needs to be done. There's this kind of sentiment that does exist here, particularly amongst certain aspects of Mexican society, that English is like this elitist language, right? Only the middle class and the upper class speaks English. They're the ones who talk about going to the United States and immigrating there and kinds of stuff like that. And there needs to we need to convince them to understand that no, it's very much a language of the working class, of the Mexican American community, of the Chicano community, especially, that they communicate in English. And so that's why it's all really important. If there's ways for people to support that work, help us translate, help us, answer some of the negative coverage, I think that would go a really long way, and obviously supporting initiatives like the Mexico Solidarity Project, like the work of the International Committee of DSA.
So let me just add to that briefly to say that Mexico has a strong history of strongmen leaders, and culture is a difficult thing to break. You need new models, and those don't necessarily exist right now. So I think one of the things we can do is to support the democratic movements from below, particularly in labor. There's some wonderful motion going on in terms of forming independent unions to oppose the former CTM, the corrupt Charo unions that were connected to the political party in power that worked for employers rather than employees. So we can definitely support that. But probably the main thing we can do is to get our own house in order. We need to make sure our own progressive movements are strong, that we too are looking to build the base to make sure that working people are conscious, active, organized. And if we do that, that will do a lot to help our brothers and sisters in Mexico as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Before we wrap up, would either of you have any last words before we finish?
Well, my last word is please subscribe to our Mexico Solidarity Project bulletin. It comes out weekly. It's bilingual. It features interviews with activists on the ground. So it's not the view from above. It's the view of people who are doing stuff in the streets, and not just what they're thinking, but what they're feeling. We want really people to get that kind of people-to-people sense of connectivity and companionship that is key to solidarity. Thanks. And maybe if you could put it in the chat, I'm not quite sure how to do it, but you can go to Mexico Solidarity Project .org and it should pop up. Thanks.
Yeah, Lisa put it in the chat there. I guess I wanted to close with what I opened, which is that your work really is indispensable. Like, I appreciate this is a Sunday, we could be doing something else, and so many of us are here together. That really means a lot to me. Like it's a sincere conviction. It means the world to me when I meet people who are dedicated to building internationalism. Like I said, while very much the principal contradiction is between capital and labor, another contradiction that is national liberation and imperialism, right? And imperialism is a very big threat, as I said earlier, right? Like, if we're able to kind of contain imperialism, it gives us room to operate and keep kind of radicalizing and putting new things on the table. And that's for the benefit of the global working class, right? Like, if all of Latin America is able to really resist US hegemony, is able to kind of start to develop a post-capitalist economy, I'm a big advocate of learning from the communes of Venezuela, right? Like, we have spaces where authentic popular power, where people own the means of production collectively and decide in assemblies what to do with it and take care of each other, right? Like, these are all examples that could very easily, like, that the border is an imaginary line, right? Like, these kinds of things, as they advance in the region, can also advance inside of the United States. And so that's why we have to practice that internationalism. And I look forward to be able to continue that work with everybody who's joined in. And just as a side note, I'm planning on being in Washington for the Americas Policy Forum, which is coming up at the end of April. If some of you are going to attend that, feel free to reach out. I'm super easy to reach. You can find me on social media everywhere, Granados, Ceja, my last names, and we can meet. We can have more of these conversations in person. Like, the more the better, because all of this is a labor of love. It's volunteer, right? Like, a Mexico Solidarity Project. Nobody's being paid for what's happening, and so if we can count on more support, that'll really help, and it'll allow us to grow. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jose and Meizhu. Really wonderful. Y'all can spend some of your Sunday, and everyone that joined, spending time of your Sunday today. I know, Meizhu, you're calling from Hawaii, so you woke up real early to go on this call. So thank you so much for that. Some quick announcements. Be sure to join DSA. We have a world to win. We must build the left and fight the right. Join the large socialist organization in the US, and join at dsausa.org/join. Be sure to join the International Committee. If you enjoyed what you heard and want to assist with building an international socialist movement, then become part of our committee at dsaic.org/join. And recordings from these and other panels can be found on the DSA-IC YouTube channel. Find us at youtube.com/@DSA International Committee. And if you have any questions about potential ideas or just queries of what we do on this committee, be sure to reach out to us at international@dsausa.org. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.